welcome to the first in a series of webinars focused on getting tourism businesses safely back to work. This series of webinars supports the publication of the Department for the Economy and the Tourism Northern Ireland Guidelines entitled Working Safely During the COVID-19 in the Visitor Economy Sector, which were published on the 23rd of June 2020. A webinar on the general guidelines, which was first aired on Friday the 26th of June, is still available to view, and I would encourage you to if you haven't already, to view that. It's available through the Tourism NI website. In the COVID-19 business support section, you'll find the links to it there. So all the webinars that are running this week have been designed and delivered by Tourism Northern Ireland under the Tourism Enterprise Development, otherwise known as the TED programme. And at the end of the webinar today, we will give you some signposts to other business support and help activities that you can avail of in your journey back to work. My name is Sharon Scott. I'm a Tourism NI mentor. I specialise in working with small tourism businesses around clustering and particularly around experience development. I've been working with a number of businesses over this pandemic period in Strangford and also in the Causeway Coast, so I'm very well aware of some of the difficulties that you're facing through the pandemic and as we move to reopening. So I will facilitate today's webinar, and I also help with the live question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Today, I'm joined by Gary McFarlane, who's the Northern Ireland Director for the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health. So in the general guidance webinar, Gary talked us through the key elements around public health and safety considerations for reopening. And that was very interesting and a very informative session. But today, he's going to really focus specifically on the critically important risk assessment process, which, given the numbers, I think nearly 100 people signed up for today, we can see the importance that you're placing on that process as well. So he's going to walk us through some of the key headings and give us some hints, tips on how to complete a robust risk assessment, particularly tailored to your specific business. I'll be asking some questions as we go along. Some of these have been supplied ahead by yourselves as participants ahead of the session today. You also have the opportunity to submit questions via the chat function in your Zoom setting, and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation. So welcome, Gary, and thank you for participating in today's session. I know it's an incredibly busy time for environmental health professionals at this time, so thank you, and I'll hand the screen to you.
Thanks very much, Sharon, and good morning, everyone. As Sharon has said, I did a small slot on a general webinar last week. I'll just recap on that because I think it's maybe useful to do so. But as Sharon has said, what I've tried to do today is focus in on the critical risk assessment process. I'm assuming and hoping that most of you, if not all of you, have read the relevant guidance that is available on the Tourism NI website. It's very good. It's quite sector specific. If you haven't looked at that in detail, I would encourage you to do so because there's lots of useful information and indeed tips that you can draw from in there. And what I'm going to say today, I've modelled around that. Just a quick word about what the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health is about and what we do. What you're seeing on the slide is the various sections of our own coronavirus hub on our own website, which is accessible to anyone. We are a professional membership body for environmental health professionals and EHOs and councils here in Northern Ireland, as well as other people who are involved in the delivery of environmental health. We offer support and guidance. We've been working closely with the governments across England, Wales and Northern Ireland on some of the guidance that's been developed. We provide professional development opportunities for our membership, and we're also an advocacy organisation. So we've been involved in some of the policy debates and discussions around the COVID pandemic. I think in particular what I would highlight that may be of use or interest to the audience this morning is in our webinar section. We did a webinar in partnership with UK Hospitality. I think the week before last. Weeks have become a little bit blurred for me, as I suspect for a lot of other people. But that's available to download and look at. And it went into quite some considerable detail on some of the challenging areas for the hospitality sector. So, if you want to look at that, you can do so. If you ask me to summarize what I think the two key challenges for the hospitality sector in general are around reopening, it would be these 2 points. The first one is it is all about the control of this infection and this virus and the prevention of onward transmission. Now, fortunately in Northern Ireland, our epidemiological numbers, that's things like our infection rate and number of cases and so on, is in relative terms very good, if you can say that. It's certainly better than the rest of the UK, and that's certainly the way we would like to keep it. I'm sure members of the public, businesses, civic society, everybody wants to keep it that way. It's important though that we're not complacent, and it's very important to recognise that this problem is not, we are far from being out of the woods yet. So the risk assessment that I'm going to talk about is really all about the control of this infection and the prevention of onward transmission. And I just want to mention rebuilding public confidence. I think this is particularly important for the hospitality sector. Certainly, there's anecdotal evidence that suggests that significant numbers and sections of society are very apprehensive. They're going to expect to see controls and so on in place in the premises that they're visiting and they're patronising, whether those are pubs or restaurants, whether they're bed and breakfasts or accommodations, whether they're visitor attractions, whatever. I think you can be assured in terms of the controls that you're going to look to put in place that they will be expecting to see those controls in place. So you shouldn't be frightened of putting them in place. And that's a positive thing in terms of some of the things that you'll be looking to do. As I've already said, the whole thing is all about risk assessment and putting in place the appropriate controls. Now, this sort of terminology and language can be very daunting for people, and I'm very aware of that. So I'm going to try and simplify this as much as I possibly can. And I'm going to take you through some worked examples that are relevant to any hospitality sector setting, whether it's a bed and breakfast, whether it's self-catering, whether it's a hotel, whether it's a pub, restaurant, visitor attraction, whatever. But the purpose of this slide is to give you some generic headings that you can use to develop your risk assessment. Now, I've tried to be comprehensive, and they're not going to necessarily be relevant to every single situation. So, for example, workforce management may not be particularly relevant if you run a small B&B as a couple, and there only is 2 of you. But it will be relevant, obviously, if you have a number of staff, even a small number of staff, 5 or more. Second point to make is that these headings are taken from the excellent guidance that Tourism NI have been involved in putting together. I would refer you to that as I've done previously. If you haven't looked at it already, then I commend it to you, and these headings are based on that guidance. So let me just briefly explain some of them. I hope most of them are self-explanatory. Cleaning and hand washing are the 2 examples I'm going to take you through. So, I mean, they're fairly self-explanatory. They're going to apply to every premises. Social distancing we know all about, and I'm very happy to take questions that you may have around social distancing, but it is key. It's important to say that maintaining this social distance between individuals is key to infection control and the control of this virus moving forward. You will all know that the previous guidance has been 2 meters, and then last week that guidance has changed to at least 1 meter. And you're also all aware, I'm sure, that there are certain circumstances and certain settings where maintaining at least 1 meter social distancing is not actually possible. So let's be realistic about that. And the sort of examples I'm thinking about are particularly, for example, restaurant kitchens, really good example where they're often very small, and 1 meter social distancing is not possible. But there are things that you can do to actually mitigate. That's the word that's used. Mitigate means offset or reduce the risk where the social distancing is less than 1 meter. So things like, for example, not avoiding face-to-face working positions where 2 people are actually facing each other, and changing that to either back-to-back working or working at an angle to someone else at 90 degrees, for example, will help reduce the risk, because the risk here is all about droplet. It's about droplet spread and droplet infection. That's how the disease primarily gets transmitted. Obviously, the use of face coverings is also important, and I'll talk a little bit later about PPE. Managing customers, I've mentioned that already, and managing customer expectations is going to be really important. PPE, I'll deal with in a separate slide. Illness reporting, what I mean by that is, if you do have staff, if you have, if it's more than a sort of 2-person couple operation, and you have staff, then it's really important that you make sure that staff are aware that they need to let you know whether they develop any symptoms. Another key part of controlling the spread of the disease is going to be making sure that where people have symptoms, that they take the appropriate precautions. So it's really important that you get that across to staff, that they tell you if they develop any symptoms that are COVID related. Workforce management, I've talked about, and I'll deal with that in turn as well. And then the final box on this diagram, service procedures. What by that I mean things like service in terms of food, or indeed where there are maybe some specific procedures that you need to think about developing, and we'll deal with that as well in turn. Now, the first thing to say, and there's been lots of people have asked this, are there templates for risk assessments? And the answer to that is yes. This template that I think is one of the ones that I would advocate you use, because it's very simple, it's very generic, it's relevant to any setting, is the one that the Health and Safety Executive in Northern Ireland have provided on their website. And the first hyperlink on that slide is the link to this particular template. So you can go to that link, download this as a Word document, and edit it as you see fit. So very straightforward. And what I've done, I'll talk you through each column in turn, but what I've done here is work up a simple example around hand washing, which is obviously one of the key controls that we've all been told from the very start is really important in controlling the spread of the virus. But if I can just deal first of all with the layout of this template, and in particular the headings across the very top. So the first column that describes the hazard, insofar as your risk assessment for COVID-19 is concerned, is going to be the same for everyone. So the spread of COVID-19 is, as I've already said, in terms of infection control and preventing spread, is where the game is at here. So that remains the same for any business, and indeed for any aspect of the business. Likewise, the next column across, which simply describes who might actually be harmed by that particular hazard, the spread of COVID-19 virus, is simply a list of anyone that you think is going to be potentially affected by that. So if you've got staff, it clearly includes your staff. If you are a premises where you have visitors, it'll include your visitors. You need to think about your contractors, drivers if you have them, delivery people who may be visiting your premises. And of course, it's important to remember that we have, as with any disease and any illness, there are vulnerable groups, elderly or pregnant workers, those with underlying health conditions, or anyone else who comes into contact with you in relation to your business. Moving across then, the next two columns deal with the controls required and any potentially any additional controls that you maybe need to put in place. And this section of your risk assessment allows you to simply systematically think through what controls are necessary. And a control, by the way, is simply something that you can do to reduce risk. So we're looking at hand washing here. So, what controls are you going to need to ensure effective hand washing? And as I say, I've tried to keep this fairly generic, but this sort of premises that I was thinking about whenever I was doing this is possibly a small restaurant, or perhaps a bed and breakfast where there are public areas. There's maybe some food preparation areas, etc., etc. There's maybe some public toilets. So in relation to hand washing, you need to have hand washing facilities with soap and water in any kitchen areas and any toilets. You would have to have that anyway. So that's not in itself unusual. In terms of hand washing in public areas, I would recommend that you consider using gel hand sanitizing facilities, particularly alcohol gels. Now, the reason for that is because that then avoids the need for any hand drying facilities. And this is, by the way, in public areas. So whether that's, waiting areas, or whether it's, in the dining area, in a bed and breakfast, or in a restaurant, or small hotel, it's having hand sanitizing facilities available for your customers and members of the public to actually use. And by the way, this is for members, predominantly for members of the public, but also, of course, in, say, for example, a small restaurant, it would include waiting staff who are using the floor. So it's about having adequate hand sanitizing facilities available. Alcohol gels will reduce the need for drying materials, which does two things. One, it avoids the need for you to manage the waste from any paper towels. And two, it reduces the need for that particular material in the first place. But it's important to say that that's just my recommendation. It doesn't mean that you can't use other hand sanitizing facilities. I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about cleaning and how different cleaning chemicals are, how the virus is affected by them. You're going to need to make sure that stringent hand washing is taking place, both by your staff if you have them and members of the public. And if you are using drying facilities, for example, in perhaps toilets or in kitchen areas, that there's adequate supplies of preferably disposable paper towels. Paper towels are the best method hygienically and microbiologically to dry your hands. That's not to say if you've other facilities you can't use them. So there's been lots of talk, for example, about hand dryers and are they safe to use. I mean, if you've got hand dryers and you have washed your hands adequately, then obviously you should use them. And then looking at the additional controls section, important to what I've put in here is a little bit of detail around effective hand washing. And it's important to remember that for hand washing to be effective, you need to do it properly. So let me explain that to you. If you're using, for example, gel or soap, liquid soap, or some other form of hand sanitizer, put the liquid onto your fingers first, not the palm of your hand. because that does two things. One, it's your fingers that come in contact with things, obviously. But secondly, it's the finger areas that are not often adequately cleaned when people don't pay attention to how they're hand washing. So I don't know whether you can see my screen here, but what I'm saying is you rub your fingers together like this with the liquid on it. So that's the sort of thing that you would want as a proprietor of a business, to just set a little bit of detail out on that. I've also included in here, reminding people to, if they're coughing or sneezing, to catch it in tissues or use their elbow. Encourage your staff to report any problems with hand washing, and think particularly about perhaps signage in key areas, for example, in toilets. And then, moving across, the next two columns deal with who's going to be responsible for that. Important to identify who's going to be responsible for it. And the next column deals with by when. Some people would call that the frequency. How often or when does this need to be done? And the final column just allows you to actually use this risk assessment template as a little bit of a checklist. So you can use it to actually tick off on a daily basis that everything's been covered off. So that's a quick walk through, for example, a hand washing in a premises as a key area, a key control area that we're going to need to put in place to control the spread of the virus. Okay, so moving on to cleaning. Again, hopefully by now I've explained what the columns are. So you'll see here that, the first two columns, the hazard and who might be harmed by it, remain the same for the whole of this risk assessment for this particular premises. Once you've done it, it doesn't matter what aspect of running the business you're talking about, whether it's the cleaning regime, whether it's hand washing, whether it's social distancing, whether it's workforce management, whether it's customer management, whatever. It's going to be the same hazard and the same list of people who might be harmed that you need to think about. So let's think about cleaning. On this particular example, I've identified specifically a kitchen food preparation area. Now, in a kitchen preparation area, you should already have a cleaning schedule. If you have your hazard analysis done correctly. So there'll already be a cleaning schedule done for your kitchen premises. What you might want to think about in relation to this COVID risk assessment is perhaps an increased focus on your disinfection of touch points in particular. By touch points, what I mean is simply areas that people touch on a regular basis. So in a kitchen, that would include things like fridge handles, sink taps, light switches, equipment knobs, etc. Anything that people touch on a regular basis. Now, your cleaning rota, I would suggest, in a food preparation area should already cover. That should be done at the end of every shift. Those sort of contact surfaces should be disinfected at the end of every shift. And provided that that's happening, and provided that no one else uses the kitchen facility before the next food preparation shift starts, there should be no need to do it again. But you need to make sure you're doing it at the end of every shift so that everything's left clean, using the proper disinfectant, and I'll come to that in a moment, at the end of every shift, and is ready for the next shift to start. Typically, that would be done by an allocated member of staff. If there is a head chef or someone who's responsible for the kitchen prep area, they would be ultimately responsible for that. Then turning to public areas and perhaps points in the operation, like maybe a bar, if you have a bar, or a service point, it's about having and you'll see in the middle of the additional control, I've suggested that you might want to think about a cleaning chemicals and procedure. In other words, again, this is going to depend on the size of the business, but if you've got staff and you've got different members of staff being responsible for this at different points in time, if you're going to be developing a rota, then I'd suggest you need a simple procedure set down for cleaning of public areas in relation to COVID-19, which would include, critically, what chemicals are going to be used, how they're going to be used, and how often that cleaning is going to be done. So 3 things: what are you going to use? How is that process going to be carried out, and how often. That's essentially, one general point I would make to everyone is this is a logical process. Everyone, you don't need to be frightened about this. If you think about it, all I'm talking you through here is a logical process. So that's your cleaning chemicals and procedure. And I'll come to cleaning chemicals in a moment, because there's been lots and lots of, I've been asked so many questions over these last few months about what chemicals to use and what's effective and what isn't effective. And the good news is it's really simple, but I'll get to that in a moment. Toilet areas, I've listed there. You might want to think about that in a specific area for premises as well, simply because it's an area where people are concerned. A lot of members of the public are going to use toilet facilities on these kinds of premises. So they're going to need to be thought about in terms of additional cleaning in relation to preventing the spread of the virus. So I hope that those two examples have given you a little bit more insight and given you a little bit of reassurance about how you approach completing your risk assessment. I stress again, it's simply a logical, systematic approach to the different areas of running your business.
And we know through the guidelines that it's a holistic look you're looking for, both outside and in. And a question has been raised about the use of potentially cars or vehicles involved in a business, and do they form part of this risk assessment?
That's a really good question, Sharon. And the short answer to that is yes. If a business uses vehicles on a regular basis, then obviously they need to be included as part of this risk assessment. Now, I can think of maybe a couple of different scenarios or examples of where a vehicle might be used. So perhaps it's a vehicle that's used by different members of staff for deliveries or collection of goods and materials. So the scenario being that it's a vehicle, doesn't matter whether it's a car or a van, that's used by different members of staff. So thinking about that in terms of a risk assessment, what do you need to do? Well, you need to simply disinfect it in between uses. And by disinfection, let's be clear, I'm talking about the points in the vehicle that people touch. So it's the same as public areas in a business. It's about disinfecting that after each use. So steering wheel, indicator knobs, door handles, gear levers, that sort of thing. Giving it a quick wipe. As I said, I'm going to come on to the cleaning here in a moment, but that's how we deal with that. If it's a vehicle that is used to actually, in a taxi sort of scenario where you're taking customers in it, then I would suggest that the guidelines around that have been developed for taxis would need to be followed. Now, three key points to make. You'd need to apply the same sort of cleaning regime in between uses of different groups of people. That's the first point. The second point is, my understanding is that the guidance suggests that face coverings, and I'll come to PPE in a little later on and explain the difference between face coverings and face masks, but face coverings would need to be used in a vehicle because it's one of the mitigating things where you can't maintain necessarily good social distancing of at least 1 meter. And the third point I would make is the guidelines around people gathering in indoor spaces would need to be followed here. So that would mean it would be a family group that live together, plus potentially one other person that is in that bubble. What you couldn't do is put two different families into the one vehicle at the same time. Hopefully that makes sense. Moving on then to cleaning, and as I said, there's been lots and lots of questions around cleaning, so I think it's important to maybe just spend a little bit of time explaining it. Now, this is quite a scientific slide, but don't worry about that. The reason why I've put it on is because the good news is that coronavirus is what's known as an enveloped virus. And you can see at the far left-hand corner of that diagram at the bottom of this slide, envelope viruses are the easiest to destroy, which is great news when it comes to dealing with the cleaning and prevention of spread of this virus. For those of you who are familiar with food settings, you will know that in a food setting, in a restaurant or in a commercial kitchen, you're dealing with cleaning regimes, and you need to put in place cleaning regimes that would deal with things like bacterial spores, for example, which are right up at the top of that diagram. So that's why I'm saying that the cleaning, if you've done your cleaning schedules for your kitchen properly, and if you've matched the cleaning chemicals that you're using in the kitchen setting correctly, then they should deal with destroying this virus. So you don't need to do anything different or change anything about that. But what about public areas? And that would include things like vehicles that we've just talked about, toilets, common touch points where the virus may be on the surface and there may be a risk of transferring that to someone. And the final point here on this slide, the bullet point where I've said in non-food prep areas, solutions with sodium hypochlorite at least 1,000 parts per million by volume, or ethyl alcohol spray to at least 70%, that's very scientific, so I'll explain it in a little moment, are sufficient to kill this virus. Now, sodium hypochlorite is the common chemical compound in household bleach. So you do not need special cleaning chemicals to deal with cleaning your contact surfaces to kill this virus. Household bleach, provided that it contains at least 1,000 parts per million, and you should see that on the label if you look, by volume, sodium hypochlorite will be sufficient to kill the virus. And you can use that in a spray container to spray on to your contact surfaces and then remove with a paper cloth. Ethyl alcohol, on the other hand, you don't need to wipe off. It will evaporate. So it removes the need to wipe the disinfectant off the surface. Although I don't think that this will apply to many of the sort of touch contact points we're talking about, just do remember that if it's dirty, you need to clean it first with detergent. So if the contact point is dirty, get the dirt off it first before you use the disinfectant. We've sort of already covered this, but this again is just a little diagram to explain effective hand washing. Remember that you should put it on your fingertips and that you need to wash your hands vigorously, including in between your fingers and your fingertips, for at least 20 seconds. Okay, social distancing, very important. So I've already mentioned this and said a little bit about it, but just again to re-emphasize that it's really important that you make sure, as the manager or owner of a premises or facility, that both your staff, if you have them, and customers are aware of the need to maintain social distancing. It's really, really important. You know, this is one of the key ways in which we will prevent the spread of the virus. Now, in a food setting, whether it's a pub serving food, whether it's a restaurant, whether it's a bed and breakfast and it's an evening meal, it's really important that you emphasize to customers that they stay at their tables. This is not like the current or the normal situation in these settings, where people may well get up and move around and go and talk to people at other tables and socialize with them. That's just not possible at the minute. So it's really important that you emphasize to your customers that when they're in that sort of catering setting, that they stay at their tables. For other visitors and contractors, again, it's important that they follow the procedures on social distancing, and that you, as the business owner or manager, make sure that you reinforce that to anyone who visits the premises. And the guidance from the 4th of July for hospitality is, of course, at least 1 meter. But what I would say to you is, if it's possible for you to advocate 2 meters or more, continue to do that. The simple truth is that the science hasn't changed on this, but obviously the distance has been a calculated judgment based on the epidemiological evidence and so on. But the simple truth is that the closer you get to someone, the more the risk increases. And just if I can share with you something that illustrates that very well. I've been working with colleagues in England around the contact tracing system and the setup of it. And the contact tracers, which is test and trace, it's known as in England, and there is a system operating here. One of the things that the tracers are very interested in, if they are following up anyone who's been in contact with a confirmed positive case, is how close and how long those contacts have been in touch with the positive case. If they've been at 2 meters distance, they have to have been in contact with that confirmed positive case for at least 15 minutes, face to face. However, if it's less than a meter, it's potentially less than a minute. And that is a very stark illustration of the importance of maintaining this social distance. I've already said there are some situations where that's not possible. We've talked about the use of face coverings, and I'll come on to that in a moment and explain what those are in those settings, and also other mitigating measures like, if possible, the use of screens and or the use of avoiding face-to-face working scenarios, particularly in situations like kitchens. But I can't overemphasize the importance of maintaining this social distancing, and that has to apply to your customers as well. I've already said my own view is the public will be expecting this. They'll expect it. I think it's important to be realistic. There's going to be situations where that will be forgotten about. You need to re-emphasize that to your customers. Use of PPE. Now, again, there's been lots and lots and lots of, I've dealt with I've been involved in lots of conversations about this, when it should be used, should it be used. I've already talked about face coverings, and I'll explain that in a moment, in certain situations. But it's important to say that the official guidance does not advocate the use of PPE, personal protective equipment, necessarily in any non-clinical setting, and that good social distancing is sufficient in most cases. But as I've already explained, in certain cases, if that social distancing of at least a meter cannot be, PPE or face coverings can be used in mitigation. Now, what's the difference between a face covering and a face mask? A face covering is what you see the vast majority of perhaps members of the public and other people wearing, where it's a simple, what it says, face covering, typically hooked around your ears, typically a piece of cloth or a piece of lint that covers your mouth and nose. That is not the same thing as full, it's called FFP3, that's full face protection grade 3 personal protective equipment that many of us have seen nurses, doctors and other healthcare professionals using in clinical settings, where the masks are fitted tightly to your nose and mouth, and they contain a valve which allows for the inhalation and exhalation of air. It's an entirely different type of device. And face coverings primarily protect other people. They protect other people from the droplets coming out of your mouth. They do not offer any real degree of protection to the wearer from droplet infection because they're not sealed around your nose and mouth. So really important to understand the difference. Gloves, my own personal professional view is that gloves are not a substitute for good hand washing practices and procedures. And we've talked about hand washing and the importance of it. In fact, there is a danger that gloves can lull people into a false sense of security, but it's important to remember, and if you do choose to employ the use of gloves, and that is a matter for the business to decide, there's no right and wrong reasons, no rights and wrongs about it. But please do remember that gloves do not, again, the virus can be present on the tip fingers of gloves just the same way as it could be present on your fingers. And they're capable of spreading it just the same as your bare hands are. So, as I've said, my own view is, personally, I think good hand washing is a better control than the use of gloves. If you are using gloves, you need to make sure that people still observe really good hand washing practices and procedures. To go back to the use of face coverings, I mean, some businesses have suggested, particularly in service settings, like restaurants, they've suggested that they may consider their staff using face coverings. Again, that's a matter for the business. It's not wrong to do it. It's just important, and it does certainly offer a degree of perhaps consumer confidence, because face coverings will protect members of the public, obviously, from any droplets that might be spread by members of staff. But they're not an essential requirement. Hopefully that clears that one up. I think it's really important for hospitality businesses to make sure that their customers are clear on what is expected of them. And we've already talked about social distancing, we've talked about hand washing, we've talked about, for example, whatever procedures you put in place for the use of public toilets, etc. Really important to make sure customers are clear on what's expected of them. I know that there's a wide variety of different settings involved in the hospitality sector, whether it's business attractions, whether it's accommodation, whether it's hospitality like restaurants and so on, cafes. But consider, if it's a booking system, consider things like, for example, including a little simple information sheet in your booking, having a summary of what is expected of customers on your website if you have a website. Second point is, be prepared to remind them, particularly in certain settings where I'm thinking particularly about restaurants and cafes here, where people may forget the sort of things that you've asked them to do, like remain at their tables, use the toilets one in, one out, whatever you've decided to put in place for that. Involve, in terms of your staff, if you have staff, make sure you involve your staff in this risk assessment that you're going to do, and indeed in the controls, both in thinking about what they're going to be and in actually putting them into practice. Very important point here, if you've got staff, make sure that you emphasize to your staff that it's really important what they do outside work. And what I'm getting at here is that they follow the guidelines and the rules around social distancing and mixing with others, not just while they're at work, but whenever they go home as well. You'll be aware that there have been some very high-profile outbreaks in England, particularly in large processing plants. The evidence currently suggests that the root cause of that is what has happened outside the workplace, not what has happened inside it. So that, what I mean by that is, who people are mixing with, how they get to work, do they share transport with other people? It's the same basic rules. It's the social distancing, and it's the good hygiene practices. But it's important that you stress to staff that what they do outside work is important. Stay safe and stay within the guidelines. And finally, the risk assessment, that is key to the safe reopening of businesses. You need to keep it under review, particularly in the early stages. No one is saying that, it's important that you do it. Don't be frightened of it. You might get it wrong. You might find that you need to change something. You might find that a procedure that you've tried to put in place doesn't work and there's a better way of doing it. That's fine. Keep it under review. Make sure that the staff are engaged in suggesting improvements as well. And of course, if official guidelines or legislation changes, it's really important to review your risk assessment in light of that. I hope that has been useful. And Sharon, I'm going to pass it back to you now for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gary. That was very informative. And there's a host of questions coming in. I would actually point out that there will be a number of sector-specific webinars happening during the week where we will start to really drill down on some of the questions that are being asked today on specific sectors. There's one tomorrow, which is very applicable to small B&B, small accommodation providers. There's one on tour guiding coming on Wednesday. There's a list of those, and I'll take you through the links to those at the end of the session. One of the first questions, Gary, and it's just picking up there on the risk assessment and the need to involve the staff. In your professional opinion, how often should the owner or the management sit down with the staff and review the risk assessment, particularly in the beginning, at the very around reopening?
That's a good question, Sharon. I mean, I think that trying to strike a balance between what's realistic and what's appropriate, I would suggest weekly at the start. Now, it needs to be triggered by other things, as I've already alluded to. So if there's a major change to the government's guidance, or there's a major change to the legislation or anything like that should automatically trigger a review. So you need to keep your ear to the ground on that. But in terms of, feeding back on how it's working and whether it's workable for the staff, for the customers, and any improvements that can be made, I would suggest weekly.
Okay, and then obviously just as you go through the process. The other one actually is about monitoring and the enforcement going forward. What is the procedure? And we know environmental health and local council levels are looking at this. So what will happen as we go through the reopening period?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, the first point to make is really important to make the point that my colleagues in local councils are going to be under severe pressure here, because it's not just the hospitality sector that's reopening. It's almost all businesses, and the responsibility for health and safety, really, and infection control, which is what this is all about, falls to local authorities. So, we've not just got hospitality, we've got hairdressing, we've got beauty parlours, we've got, the retail high street. There's a lot of businesses reopening, but they will be checking businesses to make sure that they've got these risk assessments in place. I think I can speak for local councils, and incidentally, there's lots of really useful resources on almost all the local council websites, and I included the link to that in the slide, so please do check that out. But I think it's important to say that my colleagues in councils have always adopted a very proportionate enforcement approach, and I don't think that that's going to be any different in relation to this. They will expect you to have had a go at it. But don't be frightened of getting it wrong. If there's problems, if they look at your risk assessment and believe that there's changes need to be made and improvement needs to be made, they'll tell you what they are. They'll work with you to do that. So there's nothing to worry about here. There's nothing to be frightened of. The worst thing that you could do is just ignore it. It's really important that you apply a little bit of thinking to this and get a risk assessment done.
Okay, thank you for that one, Gary. There's an interesting one here about there's been conflicting information about the use of fogging machines, particularly around the accommodation sector, for cleaning soft furnishing. And the questions ask, are these effective and are they necessary, or is good ventilation just as effective?
Okay, well, it is important. Certainly, ventilation is very important in terms of the potential spread of this virus. And that's why, for example, the guidelines around outdoor gatherings for people are so much more relaxed, if that's the right word, than they are indoor, because clearly the ventilation situation outside is very different. It's also important, I omitted to mention, and this is an important thing to say, that the scientific evidence suggests that the virus is not capable of surviving on any surface 72 hours. So if there are different aspects of the business where you're able to actually use that 72-hour period, then that obviates the need for any sort of fogging or cleaning or such like. I think that I go back to what I said. I mean, there is a whole I could signpost, and I could provide this to you afterwards, some links to some useful guidance specifically around cleaning. It's quite complicated, Sharon, to go into here, but there is lots of information available on different cleaning techniques, what works, what doesn't, what's appropriate, what isn't. I mean, I would go back to what I said, you know, in terms of the virus and it's how easy it is to destroy. Yes, soft furnishings present a particular challenge, but you know, we need to keep it in perspective, and keep it as simple as possible. And there is, you know, I caution against companies that might be trying to suggest either compounds, chemicals, and techniques that are necessary here. I can provide some links to some specific guidance around that if that's helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, here's a very midpoint at the minute, which I'm sure is on everybody's mind. What do we do if a guest falls ill either at our premises, or whether that be a B&B or part of an attraction, or maybe with a tour guide? What on earth do they do in this situation?
Okay, well, I'm going to take it to mean, for the purposes of the question, that the guest is presenting COVID-like symptoms. And the first thing I think I would say is you need to isolate that. You know, that person needs to be isolated as soon as is possible, and until they can effectively vacate the premises or the attraction or whatever the situation happens to be. There is official guidance and advice on what people need to do whenever they experience, or if they believe they're suffering symptoms. So the individual themselves should be signposted to that official guidance, and or referred to their GP if that's appropriate. But the key thing, I think, for the premises is to make sure that that individual remains adequately isolated, both from other customers and from members of staff, until they can reasonably vacate the premises, and really that should be as soon as possible. And then obviously if it's a bed and breakfast, that bedroom is going to have to be, you're going to have to pay particular attention to any areas of the premises that individual has occupied, and provide effectively a deep clean of that particular area.
Okay, that's interesting, because I know that there's been a considerable worry, and I know some of the businesses that I've been working on were worried that maybe the person would have to isolate there for the full term, you know, the 14 days or the 7-day period. So that's not the case. That wouldn't be my understanding. No, not at all. Okay, thank you very much. Here's an interesting one, Gary. We're really taxing you this morning. This is about boats. The question has come in. If I can maintain the meter social distancing and other good hygiene measures are in place, is it okay to have people who do not live in the same household or bubble on the same trip? Any advice you'd have on specific to small boat trips or tours would be very much welcome. Okay, I go back to, I mean, first of all, I'm not sure whether there's any specific guidance relating to boat trips. But I mean, I am personally familiar with small boats, and I think that, to be honest, this is into the same space as taxis or the comments I made about you know, tour vehicles, small tour vehicles. I would think that logically you need to stick to the guidelines around same households or bubbles on this. Because it would need to be a very big boat to maintain at least 1 meter social distancing. I mean, I don't obviously know the type of boat we're talking about here, but it's been described as a small boat, and I know what a small boat looks like, and there's no way that you can maintain a meter social distancing. I mean, it's like being in the back of a taxi sitting beside
someone who is not part of your household or not part of your bubble. So I think the guidance around taxis has to be the closest you can refer to here. I'm not actually sure what that says. I would need to check it out. But face coverings are are probably going to be an absolute must here, if indeed you're able to do it at all.
Okay, so it's I suppose it's a bit like the coach tours and coach. It really depends on the size of the boat. From what I can see, that this particular boat maybe it's bigger. It's not a 2-man or 4-man boat. So it's really back to the core issue that if you can safely operate within the meter distance and you're mitigating circumstances, and it will fall back on your risk assessment.
Absolutely.
And obviously then that links back to the relevant insurance and things with the boat company, your insurer for your boat. So it's really back to that whole issue that we've reiterated through the presentation today. It is all incumbent on your individual risk assessment, and you can demonstrate that. So I hope that answers. We'll maybe have a look there and see if there's anything specific and how it relates to taxis. That would be one that we will push back up to the working group and people who developed this around the boat trip issue. Okay, thank you very much. A lot of questions coming in just around a bit of confusion about cleaning materials. And there's one here actually around the cleaning chemicals. Please clarify the actual chemicals around bleach. Is it a spray bleach or a pure bleach, as in Domestos?
No, it's not. It's all to do with the concentration, the parts per million of sodium hypochlorite in the solution. Now, a bit like I'm trying to think of a useful analogy here. So Domestos, for example, it should tell you on the label what the concentration of sodium hypochlorite in that solution is. And you would then, you would then need to make it up. If you're using household bleach, you then need to make up a solution that is 1,000 parts per million sodium hypochlorite by volume. So that means that if you're using a litre of water, you put 1 milliliter of bleach in it. If that is pure sodium hypochlorite, but you need to refer to the label to check that it's at least 1,000 parts per million sodium hypochlorite by volume. Sodium hypochlorite is the ingredient, if you like, the chemical that is in almost all household bleaches.
So it's safe to say then there's not necessarily, and this is part of the question, you have to go out and source specialized cleaners. And I know
that is specifically exactly my point, Shannon. You don't have to source special cleaning chemicals here. In terms of application for the likes of touch points, light switches, door handles, and you obviously need to be careful about using bleach solutions in food preparation areas. I did make that point. But in public areas, I would suggest a spray solution that you can spray onto the surface and then remove with, I would suggest, a paper towel.
And following on from that, actually, just a little question around steam cleaning. Does steam cleaning destroy the virus?
I would believe it does, but I would need to check that. It depends. I mean, that's a very general question. It depends on what the surface is, how precisely it's being steam cleaned, etc. As I said, Sharon, I think if people are interested, I can certainly provide a couple of links to very, very good websites that deal with the cleaning issue in some considerable detail, if people want to go into that detail.
Okay. Yes, I think there's a lot of stuff coming through in cleaning, so obviously everybody's homing in on this particular issue, so that would be quite useful. Here's a question. It's from a coffee shop, and just to reiterate, we will be having a session on hospitality restaurants and coffee shops, particularly in Thursday's webinar, so do look out for that one coming through. But this person has asked a very relevant question around the issue of getting people to line up, ordering food, pay and sit down. That's the normal working procedures. They're asking, can they still allow people to do this safely? But would Gary think that this is not feasible? Should I get them to come in and go straight to the table instead?
If you can do that, that's by far the best way to do it. Absolutely. You know, and I appreciate that that's maybe out with your normal modus operandi, but in the same way as in a restaurant setting, they're all avoiding the use and you know, so restaurants, for example, that are geared up for this and have typically a bar area, they're just stopping any service at the bar. So drinks will be ordered from the table, payment will be made from the table, and I would suggest that's the sort of system a coffee shop should be looking to employ as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Then a more general question, and it's something I know that I've dealt with quite a bit with the particularly the small businesses over the last few weeks, around the risk assessment process. And can you give the participants here any advice about how they communicate that risk assessment? Is it necessary to put the risk assessment fully on a website? Is there any obligations around that in terms of legislation? How do they communicate to their customers, and whether it be residents as well, what they've done in the risk assessment? Is it necessary to publicly advertise a full risk assessment or not?
In terms of make it publicly available, I'm not aware that there's a requirement that they make it publicly available, but I would suggest, given the situation we're in, that if it's possible to do that, there is absolutely no harm in doing that. So if you do have a website and you do have the ability to post this onto your website, then I can see no reason why you wouldn't do that. Certainly you could, if a member of public asks about it, my advice to you would be, why would you hide that from them? What would you need to be worried about? Make it available to them. Certainly in terms of the regulating authorities, and as I've already explained, that for the most part, that's going to be local council environmental health departments. They will obviously expect to see it, should be made available to them as and when they require it.
Okay, that's interesting. And I know that when I've been working with small tourism businesses here in the Causeway Coast, I've been certainly advising them to put little snippets, whether it be photographs, text, a little short video, even just using a simple iPhone, showing the customer how they have achieved their social distancing and are adhering to the guidelines. That's all about, a point that you raised right back at the beginning about the consumer confidence piece. And while we don't want to present pictures of maybe people decked in PPE from head to foot, we do want to give that reassurance, and we do want to show that we're as businesses, we're serious about this. We recognise the still the dangers that you've alluded to, but certainly little things around your social media, across your Facebook, even Instagram, little tiny videos, short videos showing the customer what they can expect when they come to your particular business. As they enter, that there is little shots of hand sanitizing, maybe a picture of your signage. I've seen some lovely ones which deliver and communicate the message around the social distancing bit, but I've done just a little bit quirky to make the visitor feel welcome, because we are about hospitality, we're about a welcome and an experience. So it's achieving that fine balance between those two issues of safety first, but also that we do want to give you a lovely experience. And obviously coming out, and as we approach reopening, that's what the customers are looking for. We're all looking forward to getting out and about again in a safe way. So I think that's something that you should bear in mind.
I think that's a really, really good suggestion, Sharon, actually. And yes, it be innovative. Those are really good practical suggestions about how you might communicate to customers what you're doing. Little video clips, doesn't have to be, as you say, it could be done on an iPhone. Very engaging. Picture says 1,000 words and all that. So really good suggestion. They're
asking about the whole idea of a risk assessment and how the detail. Again, it's back to this thing of the detail. They've produced what they've called a 3-column risk assessment, and would this be adequate? They've just looked at hazard, actions, and what you've done about it, and the date that it's been done. Is that going to be specific for their small self-catering property?
I think that I would encourage people to follow the headings that I've outlined in the template that I've used. The hazard is always going to be the same. I already explained that it's going to be COVID-19. Sorry, the second heading was they suggested was, Sharon.
1, hazards; 2, actions, what you've done about it; and 3, the date that it was done.
Okay, so part of the problem with something as simplistic as that is, I mean, the action, it's not an action, it's a control. Let's be clear about terminology here. The control is what you put in place to actually reduce the risk of the hazard. The actions might include what staff members need to do. So I would encourage people to use the template that I've provided the examples on. It provides a systemic way of covering everything that you'll need to think through.
Yes, and there's been quite a few questions around that. You know, is there a specific one for B&B? I know around the whole hospitality catering, and again, if you want to come into the webinar on Thursday, we'll look at it more clearly. But I think the general HSE one that you've outlined it covers all businesses, and as you've alluded to throughout the presentation, the more that people adhere to a recognised template and then adapt for their property, the better, because everybody's working off the same and people will get to know that. So just to cover yourself, I know that we've been working with the businesses up here in the Causeway and taking them through some risk assessment training and some additional accreditation around health and safety working practices. So it is better. It's also better when you talk to your insurance companies, and again, just to that critical issue that we've talked about around consumer confidence, that you know that you've done it right. If you're our sharing website, or when it comes down to it, if people ask to see it, what are you doing? That you're working within recognised guidelines. So I think that's a key point. So for the person with the 3 column, maybe just go back and compare it to the HSE document and just see where there's a few gaps and fill in those blanks, just to really cover yourself.
Indeed.
Okay. Look, there's a lot of questions. Hopefully we've covered the main ones there today. We're running out of time, and I know with opening coming upon many of you this week and into the weeks ahead, you've got lots of things to do. So what I'm going to do is just spend a few minutes just covering some of the additional support. Other than the webinars that we're running today, there is a dedicated Tourism NI COVID-19 business support helpline, and the number is there on the screen, and it's also available on the web hub, which is the next point under covid19tourismni.com. This is very useful. It's got experts at the end. When you ring through during the operating hours, if the person on the line can't answer a specific expert question that needs to be, they will go and ask the experts. There's a panel of experts on hand and get back to you as soon as possible. And I know businesses have been already utilising that. That's open and it's ready to go. There's a series of webinars, as I've mentioned, throughout this morning on sector specific, around tour guiding, small accommodation, attractions, small experiences, a whole host when we get into the really specific issues for that sector. And it will all go back to the risk assessment. So it's a good partnership to have done, had a look at the general guidelines webinar, which is available on the Tourism NI site. Then looking at the risk assessment webinar that we've just done. The session today is recorded, so will be available for you to go back and look through, and there'll be various slides. And we'll also post some of the extra cleaning information that Gary has mentioned. There's in the sector-specific webinars, there's practice, good practice, hints, tips, and again, a detailed question and answer session. There's also access to specialised legal, insurance, and again, health and safety experts such as Gary, should you require anything on this issue. Just thank you to Gary for his expert advice again. It's a very, very informative session. I hope it's done what we intended to do, of give you some comfort and some support to what we know is a very daunting process that we're undertaking. It's critically important. It is the what will guide your actions and keep you as businesses safe over the weeks and months ahead. So thank you for your attention today. You've stuck with us in what is sometimes a very technical part of the webinar series. So thank you today, and just remains for me to say on behalf of myself and Gary, good luck with your reopening, and any questions, we're here to help.